Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Why Maturity Matters. We'll give everybody just a few moments to show up, but it is being recorded. And we have a fabulous guest today, Kane, who actually is the author of GRC Maturity Model. So, pretty darn exciting to be having this informal conversation. Thanks so much, Kane. Really appreciate you.
I have been looking forward to this all month. This is possibly one of the funnest events I think I'm going to do this month online.
Well, thank you. I think so as well. And you know what? I'm a nerd. I think this stuff is fun, so we should just have fun today with it.
Yeah, and I don't know if a lot of people think of like GRC and maturity as being a fun topic. So
I know. I hear you.
hopefully that we're not, for people who don't know us, we are actually like this in real life too. We are not
We
just
are.
being cheesy. This is
Nope.
actually how we roll.
Absolutely. No, truly honored that you took the time to be with us and super excited to be having this conversation. So let's get started. Very quickly, we want your questions. Again, when do you have the opportunity to have the author right here to ask questions? So feel free to put them in the chat and drop those questions in there. And if it makes sense during the dialogue, we'll just pause and answer those questions. Marva, who's moderating, will help us with those. And then definitely by the end, put your questions in. We'll pick up as many of those as we can. The agenda, you guys all signed up for it, so that's very high level. We're just going to jump right into this thing. You ready, Kane?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Awesome. Well, the first question I have for you is you and I were chatting, and this is how we just kind of hang out and chat. And we were laughing, like, what the hell is this GRC maturity model? That thing is over 100 pages. It's like crazy. Like, what were you thinking? And what is this thing?
I think it's really just a testament to how much coffee I should not drink ever again without warning my team at Hyperproof. Because I got a wild hair last year and I decided to get a few cups of coffee in me. And then later I showed up with 160 pages of text, like 8 point, just a text document. I don't do formatting very well. Outside of memes, I just don't understand how to format text, I guess. And
Good
my
at
team,
those.
bless them, like that was the second time that year because in the first quarter I dropped an analysis of 120 pages of SEC disclosures
Woo.
from 10Ks, and they've asked me, please, like, give us a heads up. So what is the GRC maturity model now that we've kind of given like a brief origin story? The reason I got the wild hair was twofold. I've been in the cybersecurity industry for about 30 years now. And something that I've seen for that period of time is the concept that cybersecurity is a problem and that it is it's going to be a project that you're going to fix. And since I've joined Hyperproof, and I was working in executive advisory doing GRC and a lot of governance and risk modeling, specifically with executive companies I was working with, something that I saw was the same idea that GRC is somehow a problem and you buy a
Uh,
product and the product somehow fixes the problem and it's
yep.
one and done, Bob's your uncle, and off you go. And the other
Yep.
thing that I was seeing as we got to the close of 2023 was the move by the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States to have a requirement for CISOs to make disclosures about their cybersecurity capabilities and their governance model and their risk model, and to put that on their 10K on an annualized basis, and that would influence share price and it could also influence litigation. And a lot of my friends are CISOs, and ultimately the way this most companies were doing GRC were that I can't put it politely, the CISOs were on the receiving end. Ultimately, like they were going to be on the sharp end of the stick if there was an incorrect disclosure made. And the reason
Yeah.
you get an incorrect disclosure is because there was not good communication between two teams that, generally speaking, haven't got on well. And that is your internal audit or your audit team, depending on your governance structure, and
Yep.
then your cybersecurity team. Because here's the thing, like your cybersecurity analyst, your cybersecurity engineer, they love coming to work, they love doing their job, they have a lot of their work and they have a lot of their job. Every day the ocean washes over their desk, and then somebody shows up and says, hey, can you give me some evidence that you actually did your thing today? Whatever it is you do, I need control evidence. So could you PDF me a screenshot of something showing that you
Yep.
did your work, and that's the internal audit team. And nowhere in the cybersecurity team's job description does it say be nice to the internal audit team, and nowhere in their compensation plan do they get paid for this bonus work. Now,
Yeah.
the comparison is the internal audit team. That's what they get paid for. That's what their incentives are. That's what they do. So there's this poisonous dynamic in a lot of corporations where people are forced to chase other people who don't enjoy being chased. And if you have a poor disclosure process as a consequence of that toxic workplace relationship, CISOs could be subject to litigation. And as we've seen with like Tim Brown and SolarWinds at the time that I was writing it, that posed a real risk to a lot of friends of mine. So,
Yeah.
like I say, sat down with a big cup of coffee, thought through what have I seen in the past 30 years in cybersecurity and in governance and in risk and compliance, and what is it that's not like hand wavy executive advisory, like what is stuff people could actually do.
Yeah.
The other funny thing, and then I will get off my soapbox briefly.
That's great.
So I was writing this thing for like 3 or 4 or 5 months. I'm not sure how long it took. It took a while.
I
And
can
towards the
imagine.
end of it, a friend of mine said, "Oh, did you ever look at the OCEG or OECG Red Book?" And I
Oh,
was
right.
like,
I would say
the
again.
the the white now, the who, and so I got a copy of it, and it read like every other executive advisory, like McKinsey type presentation, where there's a lot of magical thinking that you're going to somehow put it into action. And I didn't want that. I didn't want like something that there's no actual way to move forward, which is why the GRC maturity model is in its current form, where it's meant to be these are the steps that you can do, and it's vibes based. It's not evidentiary based, because goodness knows giving a bunch of people who read words and have very literal interpretations a tool that would require them to get evidence of their own compliance with the new process didn't wasn't the idea. So it's entirely vibes based. It's not like there's some control requirement that says you must do this. No, this is how organizations behave.
Yeah, it's a structure. I like it. You've said several things here that just kind of tipped me from my past. And so I did a lot of my career in banking and financial services, and there you have the three lines of defense. So you mentioned like this natural rub between cybersecurity and internal audit. Well, in banking, it's very much that internal audit is the third line of defense. And if you think about that line of defense, that is to protect, that is to keep the organization safe. And so we're not at odds with them. Yes, there needs to be independence, obviously, all of that. But we're definitely not at odds with each other. So I love that you brought that out. But you're right. There seems to be this thought process that this like flies in the face at each other. And then poor cybersecurity and tech people, I get it. Like their world changed. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit with another slide, but their world changed, quite a few years back with all this stuff taking a new thing where it's like, yeah, you need to do your job, but you got to do all this other stuff too. And then what you said earlier about this GRC and cybersecurity is a problem. No, these are processes, these are practices, these are disciplines that we run as part of a business, like good legal, good accounting, good HR. I mean, come on, it's the same, it's just a newer department. And so a lot of that is just a mindset set thing. But it's interesting what you said there at the end, because I remember when I was in banking and, trying to unravel this stuff for the first time. And I know the OSEG Red Book. I know because I've read it.
Okay, so you know
Even
this one. Yeah.
I know it, and I even was certified by them and went to several of their conferences. And while, there's nothing wrong with it, my continual comment was, this is so theoretical. Where do I pull a string to
Mm-hmm.
like do something? I have 600 people in IT and security. What am I telling them we're doing? Like, so I love that, one, your kind of impetus was your friends and seeing like humans in these roles and the risk that it posed to them personally, and how could you with your expertise come along and help. But then also, if it's not practical, if it's just more theoretical noise, people have a really hard time
Oh
um,
goodness, yeah. We've
implementing
got so
that.
much of that. The other thing
We got plenty of
I
that.
hope we're going to get into as well. Ultimately, the thing that I'm seeing is that part of the narrative I'm trying to move us culturally away from is that cybersecurity has historically been a black hole into which money goes into and tears come out of, and occasionally data breaches. And I think with good GRC processes, A lot of companies can leverage their cybersecurity expertise to get external attestations and to get external certifications to demonstrate their trustworthiness to their market. And I know that if you're in a B2B company, which most companies at this point, let's be honest, we are, I think that that becomes really a competitive differentiator. But again, you have to have a core business process of GRC. You have to be intentional about it. You can't just, well, like you said, you can't just have some theoretical idea because you can't action on theory very easily.
Yeah, no, that is so very true. And you're saying the same thing I tell companies all the time. And what we help companies with is build a program, build a practice, be a good steward of your business. Yes, we'll get to the compliance things. Yes, we know we need to do that. But ultimately, we're running businesses, we're protecting data and people. Like that's the whole point of what we do, right? And so that's what really makes it relevant and what really makes it matter is that ultimately that's what we're going after.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I see on this list here too, not that we're going by the slides per se, but this SEC thing, you do a lot of that. Love the LinkedIn post, by the way. I can only imagine the time that you spend on that. And for anybody listening, if you don't follow him, you really should because he, in his spare time with coffee or perhaps another beverage, he he will compile these different responses out of the filings for the SEC, and it is really interesting to see how all over the place this thing is because I used this example just yesterday that every time I drive, I probably deserve a speeding ticket because I probably speed, as do everybody else on the road with me. Because let's face it, regulatory a lot of times, isn't enough impetus for people to do what they need to do. But other things start to come onto the scene and other things start to make that matter. But in these SEC filings, I mean, even large, what you would expect to be mature companies, you're just like, excuse me? That my favorite one was the NIST
The NIST
SCF.
framework.
The
Yeah, the
NIST, yeah,
people who say they're following the
that's
NIST framework.
that's
So for
perfect.
context, there are,
Perfect.
you can go back through 10Ks up on Edgar, which is either the world's worst search engine or data breach source, or alternatively, it's a really interesting thing to try and script. You can go through there and you can find companies that say, we do the NIST framework, not which one, because the NIST only has the one, I guess, and that's that poor organizational alignment. And while we didn't see any regulatory action taken on that, thank goodness, they were not being that pedantic. I think that the companies, as we move into 2025, even though the president-elect has indicated that the current chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to be looking for work in January, I don't think that's going to change the established rules and regulations associated with the SEC. So unfortunately, we don't all get a free pass on the ability to not do those onerous disclosures. I'm also waiting for the Glass Lewis shareholder advice for how to do proxy voting, because they've started to price into a lesser degree cybersecurity disclosures in those 10Ks. So I still do believe that we are going to be required to do those. And then if we look at their examination priorities, which you mentioned my LinkedIn, boy, I read some boring documents and try to come up with memes for them. In their examination priorities, obviously they're going to keep on cybersecurity, and they're going to have there's an emphasis on looking, if you get brought up by the examinations division, which if you've ever been audited by the IRS, think of that, but think of that for your entire company and how unpleasant that would be. And they're going to start looking at not only your policy documents, but also your procedure documents. And going back to your comment there earlier, Sherry, on documentation and on people who work in cybersecurity, we don't like doing documentation. And so if the SEC thinks you're operating a paper tiger, which is to say that you've got policies, but you don't have procedures to back them up, I cannot expect that we're going to have a good time. The other thing that the SEC is rotating into is artificial intelligence disclosures. And while we haven't seen anything there yet, they are going to be putting that in the scope of their examinations. Now, the last bit of context for that, though, I'm hoping that with the change in administration, we'll see less application of novel legal theory, like what happened to R.R. Donnelly and Sons. And for those of you who don't track this stuff at a litigation level, the TLDR is that R.R. Donnelly and Sons had a breach. They were voluntarily cooperated with the SEC. They voluntarily implemented new controls. They disclosed all of this to the SEC. They still got fined for a couple $1 million. And the SEC said, no, accounting controls are cybersecurity controls. And anybody who's got a background in Sarbanes-Oxley would say that's crazy talk. I think that we're going to move away from that in 2025, but I don't think because of other organizational institutional factors that we should be de-emphasizing that ability to accurately report on which controls our company has and how they're being operated. Because I said earlier, even if the SEC isn't using them for examination like of your specific organization, what a competitive advantage to be able to specifically say, this is how we're doing stuff, right? If you need to go get a FedRAMP, or if you need to go get an ISO 27001 or a similar certification, you can use that same control and disclosure for a competitive advantage, which look at that, the slide advance. That's neat. You want to talk about this one briefly?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Let's bring it down to kind of a little bit more practical in if I'm a company and I'm sitting here thinking like, wow, that's a lot of really amazing information, Kane. I didn't know half of that, or I knew part of that, but why in the world would I embark on this GRC maturity model journey?
Yeah, I think the slide kind of speaks to it, but ultimately
Oh,
the ability of an organization to collect evidence at scale, the ability of them to report on that evidence, to be able to maintain it, is going to produce a competitive advantage for a lot of companies in the marketplace today, especially if you're in a tech industry. I think that's the most prevalent ones. I think in other industries, they have less onerous requirements that those of us who are in the tech industry are being required to follow. But also, as companies are continuing to deploy technologies like artificial intelligence, whether you're incorporated in products or you're building your own, or you're just like everybody else using ChatGPT behind the scenes, we're going to see increased regulatory scrutiny on those. And so the ability of a company to express their controls is going to become material. But
yeah,
you can't just say like, hey, let's automate all that and magic will happen and somehow, we'll get a good regulatory disclosure. There needs to
yeah,
be organizational maturity associated with that. And it needs to go beyond just the mechanical elements, but actually into the cultural elements of how companies can take a disciplined approach to get better at this. I think we'll talk later about some of the things that are actually in the GRC maturity model, but one
yeah.
of the things that I have in the risk discipline, for example, so what I had to do is I had to pick apart, like, what is risk? Like, I can't
Hmm.
say, like, I don't know, imagine go to your doctor and say, your doctor says, get better at health. What does that mean? Does that
What does
mean
that
I should go
mean?
for a run? Does that mean that I should stop with chocolate? Like what? And if I couldn't just say, well, get better at risk and get better at governance, because again, that's too hand wavy. And so inside of each discipline, I've actually broken out 10 primary activities that happen within each one, or domains that
Yeah,
then have got 4 levels of maturity. We'll get there. And one of them was, for example, like crisis communications as part of risk. Like if you're really good at incident response, and if you're really good at like managing your risks and assessing your risks, and goodness knows for artificial intelligence, there's a lot of emphasis out of the EU on being able to communicate that. But let's say you have no way during a crisis, you haven't practiced how to communicate to shareholders, you're still going to have a bad time, which is why the GRC maturity model is cross-disciplinary in that regard.
yeah, no, I love it. And this whole last bullet, the cognitive overload, that's your phrase. We were chatting one day and that popped out. I thought that was a very fancy way of basically saying that this stuff is a lot. Like it's a lot. We know because we see it, and companies don't do a great job at it as a general rule because it is a lot. They don't typically put appropriate resources at it. You've said it several times during this chat. They want to do some magic. Ooh, look, it's all fixed. And oh, it's a one-time thing. It's not, it's
Mm-hmm.
ongoing. And so this cognitive overload, I think everybody's stuck in reactive so much, just reacting. Customer needs this, customer needs this, regulatory this, blah, blah, blah. And it's just so much and they're putting it a lot of times on the poor security and tech people on top of what they already do. And I'm very mindful of that. And so it just creates this cognitive overload. And the reality is, one thing I like about this, it's almost like we've had to, you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley. I like to say it. Thank you, Enron, Houston, Texas, because I'm a
Yep.
Texan. Woohoo! But it started to bring a structure. So we all started to like play a game, but there's no like rules of the game. So we're just like, okay, go and go play, go. And everybody's just trying to keep up with, I hope this is right. And I'm just doing this. And so what I like about this is it's almost like a playbook, almost like the rules of the game. Like, hey, people, like it, don't like it, whatever. We're playing this game now. So we need to like get on where we're playing the same game with the same rules at the same level. And it's like things that people can see and talk about and can be communicated about. And then, like you said, risk, which tends to be like, I like SpongeBob SquarePants, where he says, imagination. It's almost like, ooh, risk.
Right.
It's the draws the little rainbow. And so it's the same thing, but while it's still a subjective thing and there's still nuances to it, I love the point of let's try to put some structure and quantification around that, which I think if you can do that well and start to establish the rules of the game, build a program, not be in a constant knee-jerk response, that's where that cognitive overload can really start to come down. And resources, oh my gosh, we see that all the time. Companies just don't want to put the resources at it.
No, they
Like
don't.
you're killing yourself and you're killing your people doing that.
Hmm.
So,
I also want to take one of Brittany's questions, and thank you for dropping questions in the
oh,
chat.
very
Please
nice.
do
Yes,
keep
thank you.
dropping those in there. Her question was about common challenges. Sherry, I think you addressed a lot of the common challenges that companies see when they're trying to mature their GRC processes. The other one that I'll say that I've found is ultimately there is a GRC maturity poverty line based on who you hired to run your GRC program. And the unfortunate truth of it is I've consulted with, big grown-up adult companies who you'd figure they would know what they're doing, and then you go,
Yeah.
how did you get this far without going out of business?
So
And
true.
what
So
I've
true.
found is ultimately if they hired somebody, and this is not an endorsement, but if they've hired somebody from the Big Four who's made it through like 6 to 8 years. So they're like a manager at the Big Four. If they've hired somebody there, they generally have a better GRC program. And the reason why is not because the Big Four have got this amazing program for training folks. Actually, it's because they have had industry exposure across industries and they've seen what bad looks like and they've
Yep.
seen glimmers and maybe they have seen examples of what good looks like. But
Yep.
because we do not teach GRC in our schools, it's not a curriculum that you can go get. It's not part of an MBA program. It's not
Yep.
part of a cybersecurity program. And because it is not often recognized, as you say, like a company will try to shortchange this and try to de-resource it as much as possible.
Yep.
Ultimately, if you don't hire the right person, well, how in this continuingly more litigious and regulated world are we going to be able to make this work if we just have to hire the right person? Because that doesn't scale. That was part of my other reason for creating the GRC maturity models to create scalability, because otherwise we're just going to keep doing the same dumb thing and expecting
Absolutely.
a different result.
That's so true. I like to say if you don't spend enough, if you don't put enough resources, you wasted it all. I see that all the
Hmm.
time with companies. They're like, oh, well, this is too much. So I'll only do this. Well, that just means you wasted all of it. You have to get over a certain threshold, to your point, to really start to see the value and have a strategy. And then this is, you mentioned the Big Four, and yeah, not trying to comment on them per se, but even us, we see companies in all different industries, all different sizes. We see what works, we see what doesn't work. And so, that shameless plug, but that is an opportunity for working with someone outside of yourself or hiring someone, to your point, that at least has that lens, because now you have the advantage of potentially hundreds of companies, not just this is the one way that I've seen or that I think it maybe needs to be done. Really great dialogue. Okay, so if I'm a company, practically, we
Hmm.
talked about that a little earlier. What do I do?
So, something that my friends at Hyperproof did is they helped build some self-assessment questionnaires. And on the
Ooh, good.
screen there, there's a QR code that
Yep.
will actually go to our self-assessment questionnaires. And there are four of them, one for each discipline of governance, risk, compliance, and then compliance operations and for compliance operations, what I mean is like all the gubbins that have to be in modern companies to make stuff work. So not doing this stuff manually, but actually using some level of technology, some level of automation, don't care which is funny for me to say as a company that's a vendor that does some of these things. We don't do all of the things that are in the GRC maturity model. But the ability for a company to self-assess, there's 10 questions on each of the surveys. They're anonymous. They do not collect any username. You don't have to register. You aren't going to get added to a mailing list. So just go ahead and have a go. I will say that on the back end, I do get aggregate data to see what the market is doing in terms of GRC maturity. But it's 10 questions that'll say, like, here's where you are on one of 4 possible levels. And moving from left to right, traditional is my charitable way of saying the way things used to be done. It's very manual. It's very time consuming. It's very reactive, and it's very subjective to interpretation of the person who's doing the work, and it doesn't scale. Initial are those companies that are starting to think about how they're going to get better. Maybe they've adopted some technology. Maybe they even have a dedicated part of somebody's day to go do that, but it's not still something that they're doing at scale. It's still not predictable. Moving on to that advanced level, that's where they've started to incorporate technologies. That's where they've started to have dedicated staff and dedicated scheduling and dedicated company focus. And they're starting to recognize they can actually change outcomes for their organization. And then finally moving into that optimal, that's where companies see good GRC processes ultimately a competitive differentiator and an advantage. And instead of waiting for regulations to drop, instead of waiting for some new thing to show up and that they have to just deal with, they're actively engaging with market regulators and litigation and through conversations with perhaps their senators or through lobbyists. They're actually helping to shape the larger narrative because they recognize that it is a competitive advantage for their company. And the reason that there's 4 levels and also there's 4 different distinct disciplines of governance, risk compliance, and compliance operations, you can be really good at risk management. Maybe you could be advanced at risk management, and you can be very initial at governance, and maybe you're at compliance, you're still at the traditional level. The reason that you self-assess on each of these, don't go get better at the one you're already good at. It's not going to make things better. Go work on one of your weak spots. And it's hard for us as humans to go do, to say, this is a weakness that I have. This is a challenge that my organization faces. But that's the intent of doing this, is so you can identify, where are we going to get better business value? If we get 0.2% better at our risk management processes, is that better than if we get 2 points, 2 full points? Making up these point systems fictionally, right? But if you do that, you're going to see more business value, assuming you have executive alignment with folks saying, oh, we do suck at that. We could get better at this. We could actually make it a material investment and decide we're going to, I don't know, hire somebody to run our GRC program, or perhaps we're going to actually document our processes for crisis communications, or, all of the things that come through this process. There has to be intentionality. It can't be just another oh, do this on your spare time type activity, because as we've seen, GRC programs, it is not a bottom-up process. This definitely does take executive alignment. It also takes effective organizational change management, which is going to come through these self-assessments too, of the recognition that one person, 2 people, a department probably can't just do this on their own and expect large-scale organizational change.
Yeah, there's a question, what are some of the best ways organizations can measure the success of GRC initiatives? So I think you're talking about it right here. You mentioned a 0.1 improvement, a 2-point improvement. The point is, if a company can do a realistic self-assessment, not just patting themselves on the back for things, but a
Yes and no.
realistic. Okay, go ahead.
So I was in, where was I? I think I was in Florida. I was in Florida, I think, or Las Vegas. I travel some. Anyway, my friend Andrew was there, and the way he measures the success of his GRC program, Andrew is the CISO over at Appian, great guy, is about $100,000. And every time that
Oh,
number is funny to me, because I used to do executive advisory, and we'd come in, my team would, for a company, we'd look at your regulatory, your legal, your contractual obligations, and we'd say, cool, you want to go enter this new market. Here's how effectively you're currently operating your controls. The delta between where you are today with what you're required to do and what you'll need to do, we would charge people a floor. Like the cheapest one we'd do was $100,000. And so Andrew over at Appian has a GRC program where the go-to-market team will say, hey, we want to go into Latin America, or we want to go compete in fintech, or whatever they want to go do. And instead of having a consultancy charge him $100,000, true fact, I was not his executive advisor, no prior relationship, just a funny number, right? He can now save $100,000 by doing that at scale, because he can already see, here's how effectively they're operating their controls. Here's what controls are omitted. Here's what processes are omitted. Here's what regulatory disclosures are omitted. It's an immediate cost savings, and then they can have a business conversation about, well, what would it take us to actually do this? And does it make sense, instead of what we've often seen in cybersecurity, where, you know, the go-to-market team signs the big deal and they come back and they say, cool, can we get FedRAMP moderate just done by Friday? And they tell you that on Thursday afternoon because they don't have context of what they are asking for. I think this really short circuits that. Again, it's a toxic behavior and makes it about an informed business decision. That's how I would measure GRC maturity. Ultimately, if you can express it as, we are going to have a competitive advantage that will either drive sales or reduce costs, that's how you make this win.
Yeah, that was back to the business value of this, because so much of what we're doing here is customer assurance. And so ultimately, if you tie it to that, then that ties directly to the revenue of the organization. Yes, I was thinking something much more tactical than all of that, which is great insight. Thank you. Is just giving people a way to see it and to way to see the progress over time. So much of this conversation is, well, just do what I tell you. Well, why? Because I said, because, well, because audit needs it. And people can't sink their teeth around that, especially executives can't sink their teeth around that. And you mentioned earlier that it's a bottom down exercise, not, I'm sorry, top down, not a bottom up. And I tell and a lot of times it ends up, it's more bottom up than it is top down, sadly. I mean, there's these, you get these lone rangers across organizations that really love this stuff and they try to spearhead it and they make great progress, but without that top down, it you know, they often stall. And I always tell companies it's both. Like, you got to be pushing it up, because executives a lot of times just don't even know what to even ask regarding this stuff. So you got to be pushing up to help inform and coach them. But then it has to very much go top down, because if you don't have that executive buy-in, I mean, we've seen companies, actually, we see a lot of companies where vulnerability management is a challenge for them, like really a challenge. And then if you throw in the, oh, do it by the SLA, they're like, four-letter word here, crap. And so there you go. That's a problem, right? But then executives don't necessarily fully understand what the issue is. They're not getting, so there's the top-down problem, but then they're not getting really clean, crisp, understandable, intelligible data coming up. So they're confused, and then everything just kind of stalls out. And so I really see this as a way, again, to help almost like infuse a different vocabulary across the organization, that we can like have conversations like, well, this is what this is affecting, and here's why, and here's what would happen if this changed.
Yeah, I think also you're pointing out a key communications problem that comes up that these self-assessments can help with. Because if your chief legal officer knows something is weird with your regulatory disclosure process, and maybe they've got good communications with your chief risk officer, maybe not, maybe they've got good communications with your CISO, sure, hope so. But they're not going to have those down level insights into the organization. Something that I'd really recommend that companies do is don't just have one person take one of these self-assessments. Have a bunch of people do the self-assessment, and then bin together all of the responses, or have somebody like Sherry or someone else take all of that in a structured magical Oracle format and try to figure out what is the consensus here? Because I don't think one person can understand all of GRC for an entire organization, especially in multinational, but even like a local company, it's not easy to do. And unfortunately, what that causes is you've got the person at the top saying, well, this is wrong. You've got the person at the bottom knowing why it's wrong, but not able to communicate that upwards. This is meant to give kind of a no-fault way of expressing this is where the challenge is. This is where we could intentionally choose to get better. But also, I think, as we'll talk on later slides, how you get better. Because again, a lot of this stuff historically has been hand wavy, and I don't have the time anymore for hand wavy stuff.
Yeah. And on that, we kind of got some controversial topics here in these next few slides. Here we go. But this is one of them, and it's exactly what you were just talking about. On this, we've got the traditional. So a lot of organizations are still functioning traditional, right? This is what we do, and this is kind of how we've always done it. And the reality is, and we talked about it earlier, that tech and security people, one, they don't like documentation and they're not always very good at it, quite honestly. And then here's what's funny. I'm not going to admit how many years I've been in this space, but I started in IT and grew up in the IT ranks. And Kane, you already said 30 years, so I can repeat your number. But had we known all these years ago that this is where this was going, if you're an IT person, documentation is a big part of your job description. If you're a security person, guess what? Documentation is a big part of your job description. Would we have jumped into this field? Did we know this is where this is going?
No, I don't think anybody, I think that it's a natural consequence of the way things have been happening. And ultimately, I have the privilege of having friends who are attorneys, who are economists, who are, come from financial experts, executives. I talk to a broad bunch of fun people. Never try to split a bar tab between economists, by the way. If you go out for drinks with them, they just don't understand how math works, it turns out. But if you think about like what we were worried about 30 years ago, what we were worried about was rogue nuclear material coming out of the former USSR, the Soviet Union, and being available to terrorists. And so a lot of our global policy work had been on the idea of, well, we're all just going to get nuked, so we should probably try to stop that. Not an unreasonable idea. The thing we weren't worried about was about Western nations' money being exfiltrated, not to put too fine a point on it, by a lot of Eastern nations, high China, high North Korea, high Russia, who are using lapses in security that have been there for that duration of time, right? Because of either poor understanding, poor management commitment, or ultimately the inability of us as professionals. And I am guilty. I years ago probably said things that we should do security for security's sake. Nope, we should do it for business sake. That's what we should be doing. That's what we should have been doing for this entire time. We should have been documenting it. We should have been collecting evidence so that we could have proof of how these things work and how they can actually reduce business risk. That's how we would have seen investment. But because, again, we're working on a multi-generational problem at this point. Right? We as professionals weren't trained that documentation was going to be a big part of our job, that being able to prove that this stuff actually works. Like you can go to any vendor show, you go to Black Hat, you go to RSA, and you see a lot of these new technologies posited that they're going to go fix some problem, but there's no statistical backing behind it. And that's very different when you look at public policy realms where they can say, no, actually, we have proof that if we pull these levers diplomatically or however else economically, they can show you get outcomes. In cybersecurity, we don't have the ability quite yet. And that's what's made it very hard for us, I think, as security professionals to have a conversation with upper management about here's how we can manage our risks. And unfortunately, our lawmakers, our regulators have kind of gotten, I have the sense for the past couple of years, there was somebody at the SEC who was just sick of this stuff and somebody at the FTC who was just like, darn it, we should do something. And they've become increasingly more prescriptive, which has forced us into this now challenging space where the regulators want us to do more and the EU, goodness knows they want us to do so much more. They don't. They just know there's a problem. Let's regulate it. Let's fix it. We have a group of people who have no training in this or minimal training in this and didn't get into this job to write documentation, who are trying to like meet that requirement. that's again why we're in this space where it's very difficult to align those opposing objectives, where I think most companies just want the data breaches to go down. They want to be able to have a competitive advantage, but we have this continued communications problem that's
Yep.
driving this.
Yeah, I think back in the day, because again, I have been in this, just a professional for a few decades now. And so back in the day, IT was kind of an anomalous thing. And then this whole security thing, like, ooh, and then you get some very smart people that they, from their perspective, know what needs to be done, and they have some things that need to be done to protect the organization. But again, there's no top buy-in, there's no top understanding in a lot of ways, and so they're just kind of doing what they're doing, and it's a disconnect from the broader organization. And that's going to take me to this next one, and I purposely titled this just to bait you and to see your response. But I'm just being real. But there's the disconnect, right? And now we've shifted to a world where it's like, no, this is the business, and cyber security informs the business. We make the choices we need to make. That's where the documentation comes in, a much more structured approach. But it's been so like grassroots, bottom up, but now we're in the contention of that changing. So talk to me about how important cyber risk is to an organization, because there's a lot of bubble about it. So go for it.
So, and after this slide, I want to take a couple audience questions as well, because
Oh
I've
yeah,
seen
go
them
for
come
it.
in and they are fantastic.
Perfect.
But
Great.
I think that the term cyber risk is something that ultimately CISOs who are generation 1.5. So the first generation of CISOs were all insanely technical. The second generation of CISOs that we have now are fairly business oriented, not so technical. Generation 1.5, and I'm sort of in that area. When I was like in aerospace and defense, I think I was kind of about that area of like mix of technical and business. We were positing, we were dropping FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We were saying cyber risk exists, and we need a separate cyber risk register, and we need to specifically focus on cyber risk. And now we wonder why the EU and why the SEC and why the FTC and why other organizations have decided, oh, I guess cyber risk is a thing, so we should definitely regulate that. We should definitely have laws about that. And the funny thing is, I don't think cyber risk is a thing. I think it's a fiction, and I think it's a convenient fiction that we all created to create impetus for change. And now we've got that change. And I think that if we're smart about this as CISOs and as professionals, we're going to own up to this mistake and say, actually, no, cyber risk isn't really a thing. We have business risk. Because let me give you a very simple example. If you have a manufacturing facility in Tornado Alley that makes, I don't know, let's say it makes shoes, right? I like shoes. Let's say it makes shoes. And it's in Tornado Alley. And you have a tornado, or you have a ransomware attack. What do people focus on? They focus on the fact that that manufacturing facility isn't making shoes anymore. They don't focus initially on, well, why aren't they making shoes? Because what's the consumer care about? They care about the fact that they can't buy whatever that product is, in this case, shoes. Now, the times that folks will focus on, well, what caused it, is in investigations, and that's whether it's a regulatory investigation or an insurance investigation or a legal investigation. If it's a tornado, did you have a place for shelter? Did you meet the building codes? If it's for cybersecurity, did you have reasonable security standards in place? Did your insurance cover this? Did you follow your incident response process? But it's not the risk of ransomware. You don't worry about that. That's a threat, but it doesn't have a business outcome. I think all cyber risk is a way that we tried to express we manage business risks. Now, there can certainly be technical risks, and I'm not going to dispute that point. But I think the challenge on cyber risk has also culturally been that the CISO suddenly has become the person responsible for all cyber risk. And that's produced some pretty unpleasant outcomes in the workplace, where a CISO, like if I was to go to the person who runs our sales organization, Mike, and I was to tell Mike, like, look, I think that if our sales system were to go offline, it would cost us this many hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour, and it would have this much impact to our business, and I can go fix this for you. He would laugh me out of his office, because first of all, I'm telling him how much his business unit makes. And second of all, I'm telling him my staff are going to go do something on a system that he controls. Are you kidding me? No, there's not. We went to this earlier conversation about the 3 lines of defense.
Yep.
My feeling is in the next 5 years, CISOs at major organizations are going to recognize they are not first line of defense anymore, and we never should have been. The business units should own the risk associated with their business systems, as CISO can advise them on those risks, and we can certainly have an informed opinion. But if I don't have the staff, if I don't have the resources, and ultimately at the end of the day, if my P&L, profit and loss sheet, is not affected by that system, what am I going to do about it? I can certainly point it out and say, yeah, that's a thing. The one disclosure, just going back to my point on technical risk, if you're a CISO and maybe you have an OffSec, an offensive security program, you definitely own the risk associated with having that in your house. Or maybe you, for some reason, IT doesn't own the firewalls and you own the firewalls as the CISO. Again, the technical risks associated with those firewalls, you own those, and you should probably mitigate those because that's something that's inside of your business control. But is a firewall a cyber risk? No, it's supposed to control those ones. I can't say that it does very well given the persistent attacks we're seeing. But again, we need to move from this fiction of cyber risk, move it to a conversation about reducing business risk, because then we actually get better business alignment with the other organizational leaders who have funding, who have resources, and who actually have an impetus by their P&L sheets to make a change.
Yeah. And you mentioned and I know we're going to take a question, but you mentioned the 3 lines of defense. And so that second line, that is there to work with the first line to help them understand, to hold them accountable. And so there's where that layering approach really does make a lot of sense for all organizations. Where does the risk lie? And we're going to assign ownership there as the first line, but then what is the oversight of that? So there's definitely that accountability, and then ultimately internal audit is kind of the guard for the organization against that. So it definitely is a model that fits together. Okay, take a
Yeah,
question.
let's take a couple quick audience questions.
Yeah,
From
perfect.
Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth. The question was, are there particular industries that demonstrate more mature GRC processes? Yes, they are, and it's not because they wanted to. The finance industry, for example, they will tell you they have and the reason why, let's see, GLBA, NYDFS, Sarbanes-Oxley, the list goes on. Second list of organizations is probably in the medical technology, because people get really anxious about folks dying because of medical devices. And so the FDA and similar organizations and HIPAA and so forth have really forced maturity upon organizations where they might have previously, like, some of them might have YOLO'd it. They just go, oh, let's just get the product out and see how it goes, right? I don't think that's acceptable anymore. But I don't think that beyond that, we see a lot of maturity at scale. I think that at that point we get into, certainly there are pockets of excellence in any industry, but broadly speaking, I'd say it's medical and I'd say it's financial, where our bright spots currently are. And also some of the best leaders I've met for GRC programs, personal bias, where they've had successful outcomes. The second question I want to take just briefly from Guest. Thank you, Guest. I'm not sure how you did that. The question was, how do you ensure the maturity model remains relevant as technology evolves and new risks emerge? So two-part question there. First of all, more coffee, I think, is the solution. Once people give me feedback, and I'm starting to get some preliminary feedback from implementers of the GRC maturity model, I think that's going to be really valuable for me to determine what needs to change. The second part of it is it's not really technical. There's not a technology dependency in there. Certainly you can use technology to implement certain parts of the GRC maturity model, and I did have some speculation in there about the adoption of machine learning and artificial intelligence at very mature, advanced, or optimal organizations, but I didn't say, oh, and you have to use this one, or oh, and you have to have that one. I think that as we continue to see technology change, I will incorporate that in later model versions, but right now, more than anything else, what I need is feedback of like, hey, we tried this and boy, it worked and it was easy except that one thing, because why did you write those words? That seems dumb. Or alternatively, people who say the whole thing sucks except this one thing that we leveraged. I need that feedback, because without it, I don't know what else I can change. It's kind of like, you send your children off to college. I have 2 of them in college right now, and they're out in the world. can hear from them about how it's going, but I didn't actually control it at that point. And the GRC maturity model is analogous to that. It's out in the world, it's doing its own thing, it's interacting with people, people are interacting with it. If you want me to actually change the words, DM me on LinkedIn or connect to me and send me feedback, please.
Love it. Yeah, and I think the point of what you're saying is none of this stuff is ever set it and forget it. These are continuous processes. The minute we think, woohoo, I'm there, I won, you got to start over. Like that's the way this is. It's literally the wheel with the circle that goes around and round and round. It never stops. You're building, you're implementing, you're running, you're monitoring. As you monitor, that's where you see the feedback you just mentioned. And then whatever results from that monitoring, you correct and you start the cycle again. And it truly never stops. That's with the compliance disciplines, that's with risk, that's with maturity, that's with all of the above. So definitely great point. I did want to comment to your industries. I think another emerging, the question about particular industries that demonstrate more maturity, banking, financial services, healthcare, totally agree. Healthcare technology, totally agree. But you know what we're seeing a lot of, and you're seeing it too, is those industries are pushing down their similar requirements into the companies that serve them. So now we're seeing maturing at those levels. And so if you have a SaaS company, for example, that serves banking and financial services, they're constantly being pushed down. But what about this? And what about NYDFS? And what about DORA? And what about this? And then that's helping them to mature as well. So I just wanted to add that to what you said.
I love that you're reading my show notes for my Friday episode of Drafting Compliance, where my friend Tom and I are going to drink beer on YouTube and talk about
Except for
DORA
no beer.
and no, we're going to be drinking beer. Unfortunately, our producer has found a way to mail it to us, or to send it to us, I should say, because mail would not be legal. Anyway, we should probably move on. Did we have more slides? These
we
slides
do.
look great, but wow, we are just rabbit holing on everything.
No, but it's good. And we're wrapping up. We've just got a few more minutes. We've taken questions as we went. I love the dialogue. So I'm going to talk about this one and then kind of move to the next one. And then we'll just do our final thoughts at the end.
Cool.
There was a lot of, oh, this CISO is going to go to jail and this is going to be bad. And there was all this thing. And I think what we're seeing is, yeah, while the threat is there, maybe it's not as bad as we think. And so what is that really going to do for people's response? And what is that going to do for the response of just how all this stuff continues to evolve? And then that goes right into, where does this thing keep going? Where is it going 5 years, 10 years, whatever from now? Would love your thoughts on those.
Yeah, and I think that you make a really good point. Tim Brown was the watershed moment for a lot of people with the SolarWinds breach, and it looks like he's going to not be unduly held accountable for like marketing statements on his website on his company's website that he didn't make, didn't approve, didn't see. Like the SEC trying to conflate that. I didn't agree with that. Having said that, I think that, as we said, with more litigation like what we're seeing on ICT, information communications technology providers, being brought forth by DORA through contractual is going to require better abilities for companies to communicate. This is how effectively we're doing these things, but also to be able to make informed decisions about their organization and about what markets that they want to operate in. In 2026, again, picking on the EU, the European Union's updated Product Liability Directive, the PLD, which very few people seem to be tracking yet, which is a problem in my opinion, is going to say software bugs are covered as liabilities and they have unlimited damages feasible to consumers who report that they have a defective product that could be software or could be artificial intelligence. If your company does not currently have a good way of measuring how you're managing the risks, whether those are cybersecurity risks through something like NIST CSF or NIST 800-171 or the Cybersecurity Center for Internet Security's critical security controls, or whether you don't have good alignment with something for AI risk management like NIST's AI RMF or ISO 42001. If you don't have that organizational discipline to collect, to process, to communicate outward, as we move towards this increasingly litigious I don't think anybody wanted this either in cybersecurity. Nobody was like, yeah, we want to have to talk to lawyers on the
Oh,
reg,
no.
right? I think the ability of a company to make an informed decision of, does this make business sense for us to still be operating in the EU, to sell services in the EU? I think that's going to be really a challenge that companies that are good at GRC are going to thrive. They're going to be able to say, oh, well, we do most of this stuff already, so we just needed to tidy up a couple things. But for the
Yeah.
companies that don't do disclosures well, who don't have this internal discipline, hit the panic button, right? They're going to look at this and go, well, what do we do? How do we determine if we're liable for this now? I think we saw a similar thing with an executive order in the United States, but it didn't go as far. And I think that we're going to see that one probably deprioritized moving forward, of trying to conflate software liability as being a product defect. But again, companies that do that well are going to be better served than companies that are making this up as they go along.
Yeah, and we still see a lot of that, companies that are just, they're spinning the roulette wheel with this stuff. Well, hopefully we won't get caught, or hopefully we won't get figured out, or we just keep skirting by the skin of our teeth. And I think that's what the future looks like, is customers are getting smarter, they're asking deeper questions. They will cut you off, and you will lose revenue for this stuff, and that's legit and that's real. And I think the other reality is it's not good. This is not going away. This is only going to get worse. There's not going to be this, alignment of, oh, everybody's going to come together and do it this way. And it's just not going to happen. I would love to say that it would, but we're humans. So good luck on that deal. Which means, going right back to the beginning of the cognitive overload, if you don't find a good mechanism to really kind of wrangle and have good process in place, it's just going to get worse. And then you add the legal implications, and then you add the overhead of all of this stuff. And what is the risk of if these things are chosen to be prosecuted, because you get caught doing something that you shouldn't have been doing, or not ignoring something you shouldn't have been ignoring, then that becomes more and more real, I think, as the time goes by. So thank you very much for that. What final you know closing words of wisdom would you offer to folks listening?
So if you've made it this far, or if you're watching the recording, first of all, connect to Sherry and I on LinkedIn. We are
Yes, please.
at least this much fun on LinkedIn.
Oh,
Second thing, go ahead and get a copy of the GRC Maturity Model. If you go to my LinkedIn process, it's right at the very top. It says, like, get a copy of my book. I think that's what the link says. In any event, get a copy of the GRC Maturity Model, do the self-assessment, and make a determination like, hey, does this actually make sense? And don't think, if you're an individual contributor, that you're going to make this big change and you're going to be the hero for your entire organization, because that's not the way things work. I'm sorry. Go talk to an executive sponsor. Find somebody who's willing to invest their personal, their political capital organizationally to help support that change. And then, as you think about how to approach it, if you decide, like, hey, you do the assessment, you say, look, we're good at these three things, we're not so good at this other thing, we're going to go have a go at improving this. Make sure you get a good project manager on your side so that you can track progress and communicate progress, and also consider having a good partnership with organizational change management, because that's a lot of what this is. It's less about technology, it's less about having the right tool, it's more about, how do you make people internalize these changes so they recognize this will make their job better, faster, easier, because otherwise, I guarantee you, people they'll just go, it's some initiative, I don't know why, I'm not going to care, and they won't internalize it, and they won't do it, and we're not getting better. And final thing is, if you do all that stuff, drop me a note. Let me know how it goes. Let me know if it's good. Let me know if it's bad. I do take calls on this as well. So if you want to get together and just hang out for 30 minutes, I am more than happy to provide some additional advice on what else could we do on this to help make things better.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that you hit the people change management aspect. A lot of what we do at Hotman Group is coaching, quite honestly. I think as a GRC professional, a risk professional, compliance professional, just like you said earlier, the first line of defense owns those activities. Our job in large cases is to provide the structure, provide the accountability, and the coaching, which directly feeds into the people change management. I find that if people understand the value of what you're asking them to do, then they're more readily and willing to participate, versus, for the last few decades, we've just kind of had this mindset of you have to do it and here's what it is. And while we do have to do it, there's better ways to deal with people. So I love that you brought up the people change management aspect because that really is huge. I think we answered all of our questions that came in. Did we miss any?
Let me take a quick scan here. Well, the last one was from Brittany. What's your recommendation from
Ah,
working towards a unified GRC approach? Professional bias here. Use the GRC maturity model. I think that one of the things that's specifically spoken into there around siloing and de-siloing is in the
yeah.
compliance operations section, where we should have as transparent as feasible and as ethically available communications between our various departments. Obviously, if you have ethical boundaries between certain departments that can't share or disclose information to one another, cool, that exists. I recognize that. But in general, looking at compliance operations for that transparency layer and that efficiency layer to try to drive additional organizational and alignment so you get a unified view as opposed to everybody making it up as they go along.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm honored that you took the time to speak with us today. Amazing information. I feel like I need to go back and listen to it again, but thank you so very much, Kane. Truly an honor. And thank you, everyone who attended. Really appreciate you taking the time. The recording will be available after the fact, but thank you all so very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.